This Week in Science and Education is presented in association with the Science Coordinators and Consultants Association of Ontario. Visit their website at sccao.ca.
This Week in Science and Education is brought to you in part by the University of Western Ontario, www.uwo.ca. We thank them for their support. This Week in Science and Education is also brought to you by Laurentian University. Check out Laurentian at laurentian.ca. We thank them for their support.
Hey everybody, it's time for This Week in Science and Education. This is T-WiSE, episode 80, recorded Thursday, May 14th, 2012. Hi everybody, this is Kevin Cougler from Partners in Research and the Virtual Researcher on Call program. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. We have an exciting guest today. Jim Handman's here, and he's the CBC Radio producer for Quirks and Quarks. I'm sure you've seen it. We all have. Can't wait to start talking with Jim about that program and his role associated with it. Before we get to Jim, though, I do want to welcome in my two regular co-hosts. Let's start with Dr. Thomas Merritt, Laurentian University. Hey, Thomas.
Hey, Kevin, how are you?
Good, doing well. And, of course, all the way from the Kawartha Pine Ridge District School Board, Mr. Colin Jagoe. Hey, Colin.
Hello. How are we?
We're doing well. So the regular suspects are in the room, and let's get right to Jim because we want to maximize as much time as possible. As I mentioned, Jim Handman is the producer for Quirks and Quarks. It's a very popular show on CBC. Welcome, Jim, to the show today. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So, Jim, let's start by having you give us a brief overview on what the nature of your role is as a producer with Quirks and Quarks.
Well, first, just want to correct you. You said, I'm sure you've all seen the show. Of course, we're on the radio, so you've all heard the show. So,
thank you.
And actually, we actually get a lot of mail on the program from people saying, oh, I saw your show last week and it was great. Mm-hmm. And I guess they watch their radio, and there's nothing wrong with watching your radio. Mine's quite attractive. So I'm the executive producer of Quirks. And I've been the program leader for, I guess, 13 seasons now. And just as way of background, I have no science background whatsoever. Like most journalists in North America, I think latest figures show something like 99% of journalists in North America have a liberal arts background, which is what I have. So when I came to Quirks 13 years ago, I'd been a CBC journalist for many, many years, but my actual area was foreign affairs. I was the foreign editor of Radio News. And so the learning curve was enormous. I mean, it wasn't a learning curve, it was a learning mountain that I had to climb, because I think like most people with a liberal arts degree, I knew absolutely no science whatsoever. And I mean, honestly, nothing. Natalie Angier, who's a New York Times science writer, says that most North Americans don't know the difference between a photon, a proton, and a moron. And I was one of those people. I really was a scientific moron. So I had a huge learning curve. And as you know, Quirks does every field of science. So even if I'd had a background in biology, I wouldn't have known anything about astrophysics. Or if I had a degree in paleontology, I wouldn't know anything about zoology. So it's huge having to try to, grasp even the basics of everything we do on the program.
So, Jim, I can really relate to that. Sorry, Thomas, I just want to get this in before I know you and Colin are going to take over the show. So I'm going to ask my one question, if I may. So, Jim, I'm in exactly the same boat as you. These guys talk every week about stuff. I have no idea what they're saying. What's your advice to me to get up to speed as quickly as possible on some of the scientific stuff from a guy that has a liberal arts background?
Well, as I say, you can't be an expert in everything. But I did work very, very hard to at least get a basic grounding in basic science, because I actually think you do need to have that. You do have to understand some very basic, concepts to even begin to do an interview. I read really widely. I read as many science books as I could. I took some courses. I won a fellowship through the Knight Science Journalism Fellowship to spend some time at MIT doing what was called a genetics boot camp, because this was 2000. I was new to the program. The Human Genome Project had just sequenced the human genome. I didn't have the slightest idea the difference between, DNA, a molecule, a protein, an atom. I really had no idea. So I think you do have to have some basic knowledge in a wide variety of fields. You should know the difference between, a star, a planet, a galaxy, a black hole. Over the years, it's gotten easier because I do have, more basic knowledge. So I don't know if that helps advice to you or not, but obviously you know a lot more than when you started doing this, I assume.
Well, I always tell people I'm dangerous at a cocktail party because I can talk for 30 seconds fairly intelligently about a wide variety of subjects, but as soon as they ask a question, I have to say, oh, somebody else needs to talk to me and move over somewhere else. So thank you for that. But with that being said, Thomas, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, that was a great point. Jim, I think one of the interesting things that you bring to the program, because you don't have a background in science, you also don't have a bias. And one of the things that I've sort of combated with myself in the past year, almost year and a half, we're at the end of our second season, right, is to me, the really interesting science is obviously genetics, because I'm a geneticist. And so I love having geneticists on the program. But, I've had some of the most interesting conversations with things like one of the astronauts from the Canadian program and, people that are outside of my field. And because I do have a real bias, it's something I've had to combat. The reason I had talked to you about coming on was this idea of media background, science background. So you're a journalist with no science background. I'm a scientist with absolutely no background in the media, and you and I interacted at a workshop trying to help scientists better understand the media. And I wanted to talk today about how we go from the actual doing of the science, which we've talked about on the podcast before, to actually getting people to understand or getting the word out. So when you talk to scientists, what's one of the biggest things that you run into that scientists just don't understand about actually communicating their research?
I'd say the number one problem for scientists is was kind of twofold, but it's the same idea. Number one, actually threefold. It could turn to tenfold in a moment.
And that's part of the problem.
Yeah. I'd say number one, they don't understand how the media works. Number two, which comes out of number one, they don't know what journalists are looking for. And number three, which is probably a subsection of 1 and 2, they don't know what a story is. And number four, which is the same as 2 and 3, is they don't know why other people might not be interested in their research, which is because they don't know what a story is, which is because they don't know what journalists are looking for, and that's because they don't know how the media works. So 1 through 4 all tie together. So running through all that, I get a lot of emails from well-meaning, earnest Canadian scientists, and those words go together, earnest and Canadian. And they're writing to me about their science, which is very worthy, which is another great Canadian word. They do worthy science, and I'm sure it's important to their lab fellows and their boss and the 7 other people in their incredibly tiny, obscure field across the world who read the Journal of Obscure Findings. But it's not of any interest to my mother-in-law in Saskatoon who listens to the show every week. So I'd say that's really one of the most difficult things for scientists to figure out is what's a story and what is the media interested in. Because as Thomas knows, most science is incredibly incremental and often quite obscure. And most science, and this is how science works, it builds on other science. So you do a very small experiment that builds on the work of others, and you publish in some journal, obscure or prestigious, and someone else then takes your study and builds on that, and it's all incremental steps. And incremental, the media hates incremental. We hate incremental, and we really hate uncertainty. And science combines those two in extreme measure. Science is incremental and uncertain. So, just to briefly give you the example, is that every time a medical study, and this is most problematic, I think, in medical science, but every time a medical study is published, the media wants the headline that says "cancer cured."
Yeah.
Right.
And if you Google cancer cure, you'll get 1 million results. And in fact, there's a great website. I think it's called Kill or Cure, and they track all the different things that the Daily Mail over the past 10 years has said either cures cancer or causes cancer. And it's pretty well everything on earth, from coffee to mangoes to yoga. So, either causes cancer.
Just as long as it's not coffee.
Yeah.
So
too.
So just to finish that, so we want the headline that says cancer cured. That's the headline everyone wants. The real headline is, researchers find a pathway that could possibly lead to a treatment that might in some circumstances help some people but not all, in a possible treatment that may at some undisclosed point in the future be of benefit to somebody. Well, that's a pretty headline.
That's not grabbing my attention, Jim.
So,
Colin, go ahead and jump in there if you like.
Well, you're describing what I do for a living in a lot of ways too, because that's what education attempts to do, right? I mean, we're trying to take some of these discoveries and bring meaning to them, so that your aunt in Saskatoon actually cares about it. So what's some of the magic part of the formula then for taking one of these stories and getting maybe taking one of these news items and getting a story out of it? What's some of the process there?
Okay, so the first thing is, very few studies are going to make it into the media, and frankly, very few studies belong in the media. That's the first thing that scientists have to get over. Just because you worked 15 years on your your zebrafish study, and you're so excited because you're finally publishing after 15 years about your damn zebrafish, no one cares about your zebrafish, okay? Get over it. Every week, just for instance, we get an embargoed press package every week from Science. We get one from Nature, PNAS, Lancet. All the big journals send us an embargoed press package. There might be, I don't know, something close to 50 articles in an average every week in Nature or Science. There might be 50 research articles, review articles, communication letters, news and views. Of those, the editors will pick maybe 10 that they think the media might be interested in. And in the end, if you check the online newspapers on Thursday after Nature comes off the embargo, you might find 3 or 4 at the most of those 10 from the original 50 that the media actually thought was of interest to the general public. So, message is, don't feel bad if we didn't choose your study. It just wasn't interesting to the general public. That's the first thing to get over, right?
Sorry, just going to jump in. So, Jim, would you actually advocate then on behalf of not having scientists or people with a background in science as the decision makers in terms of deciding what's going to be news? So your editors, non-scientists, do you think, primarily?
No, actually, there's no question. Although there's fewer and fewer specialist science journalists in North America, because it changes in the whole media landscape over the past 10 years, and the death of newspapers, and the internet, and trying to find a business model for producing news. Because of all those changes, news organizations have cut back on their specialty reporters, and you can be sure they're not going to lay off the sports guy. So they have laid off the science specialists, and our ranks have been devastated. Unbelievable how few are left. But let me just say, the ones who are left do a better job consistently, absolutely no question. If you have the background, the education, the training, the experience, you will do a better job of doing science journalism, and you'll be better at actually knowing what stories the public can identify with. It's in fact the editors who have no science background or training that want the coffee cures cancer story, because they don't know how to read a study, because they don't know that the study was too small, it wasn't statistically significant. They don't know those things, so those are the people putting the bad science in the media.
Hang on, everybody. We're going to be back in 2 minutes with Jim Handman from CBC Radio's program Quirks and Quarks. Thanks for sticking with us. We'll be right back in 2 minutes. Thanks.
This Week in Science and Education is brought to you by Sheridan Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning. At Sheridan, students shine brighter. Check out sheridanc.on.ca.
And we're back. Thanks, everybody, for sticking with us. We're having a lively discussion with Jim Handman today. He's a producer of CBC Radio's Quirks and Quarks. Jim, really lively discussion, great content, good stuff, great energy you're bringing to the show. Right before we broke, I believe you had a second part answer to my question, and then we'll go to Thomas for his question. So take it away, Jim.
All right, so we're talking about the fact that most science studies aren't of interest to the general public, and you won't get your study in the media. So the question is, what are we looking for? What are journalists looking for? And I have a more general answer, but in terms of quirks and quarks, and Thomas has heard me say this before, it's really simple. Your study has to be either really cool or really relevant. That's it. So, as I've said before, animal sex, really cool. Can't go wrong with animal sex. Climate change, really relevant. So on Quirks and Quarks, probably 90% of the stories we do are either about climate change or animal sex. Now, if you do chemistry, you're out of luck. You will never get on Quirks and Quarks. So I'm sorry to all your chemistry students out there. I'm sure your work is worthy and important to somebody, maybe your mother, but not to us. So that's that. So that's Quirks and Quarks. Really cool, really relevant. In general, I might expand that to say the media is looking for some certain things. The media, they want to tell a story. Most journalism is about storytelling at its root. It's all about storytelling, whether it's newspapers, radio, TV. So what do you want for a good story? You want an adventure. You want passion, enthusiasm. You want a story that has overturned conventional thinking. We love that kind of stuff. Or you want something that's, as I said, just plain cool. So those are some of the things that some of the criteria that we use to determine whether we're going to call you or not.
And I can say the only person I know that's been on Quirks and Quarks, and Jim already knows this, is a friend of mine who works on barnacle penises, which are proportionately the largest penises in the world. And J-Matt got his dissertation work on Quirks and Quarks. They're freaking enormous. They're 10 times the size of the animal. They are big.
8 times the size of the animal.
8 times. I thought it was 10. Okay, I rounded up. So, I mean, one of the things that we're touching on is the idea of entertainment versus education. And at the end of the day, Quirks and Quarks is supposed to be entertainment that's educational. It's not education for the sake of education, right? But I think one of the things that we can do as educators, I mean, our role here is science education, is the better educated our public is, the more information will be entertaining because they're going to understand things. And so the more you understand, the more variety of topics, the greater variety of topics you understand, the greater variety of topics you're going to have an interest in. And our role as educators can be to expand that horizon for the people that are listening to shows like Quirks and Quarks. Okay, that's my little soapbox on what we can do.
Can I interrupt?
By all means.
To just correct your soapbox
yes.
before you finally get to your question? I think you're going
Did
to.
I have a question?
But I always make a point of saying that what we do on Quirks is not educational. I'm not interested in educating people. Otherwise, I would have become a teacher. What we do is we inform Canadians. Now, so what I think is quite different. I think informing people is one thing. As soon as you say educational or education that involves some kind of pedagogy, which we don't have, so Quirks could be used as an educational tool. For instance, Quirks is used in a lot of science classes across the country. I get emails all the time from both high school teachers and college teachers asking permission to use Quirks in the classroom, and I always say I'm delighted. I could think of no greater honor than to have Quirks used as an educational tool, because you add the pedagogy, but we do not do education. I'm not in the education business.
Okay, I stand corrected. That's a really awesome point. Colin, so one of the things that we've talked with students about is things that they need to know to understand science. And we've talked about some basic science and collaboration and working with other people. We haven't talked about as much, at least, about communication. So how do we tie in communication and teaching students to be better communicators as part of their education in science?
That's a really good question. I think about some of the I think about some of the 80 interviews that we've had in this show, and some of them have been really good communicators, and those are the ones that we probably get the most out of because they're the most fun and they're most informative and educational at the same time. Sometimes they're not quite so good with the communication, if that makes sense. I don't know. Like, is it something that needs to become part and parcel of science education in general? I know at the K to 12 level, we have a big component in our curriculum that focuses on communication. So it's not just learning; it's how do you then communicate it back to the teacher, to your peers, to your parents, whatever. I'm not sure that continues beyond, grade 12 when they get into an undergrad as, becoming a scientist at that point. I mean, again, I see the role of K-12 not necessarily to produce future scientists, but to produce citizens who are maybe a little bit scientifically literate, which I think meshes exactly really nicely, Jim, with what you were saying is Quirks informs, it doesn't educate, where is if we do a decent job of education, then we want that information. Like, we're more able to absorb it, we're more able to understand it. Because one of the things that I think Quirks does really well, and Bob seems to be a master of this, is listening to an explanation, rephrasing an explanation in another way that makes it sound like he doesn't know what he's talking about, but explaining it really clearly, even sometimes more clearly than the scientist that had just given the explanation. So maybe there's something in there with how we teach kids about just that iterative value of re-explaining things over and over and over again to make it clearer.
And so, Jim, when you talk to scientists, one of the things that I think you talked to our group about was how you communicate. So how do you help us be better communicators?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd say a couple of things. The first is, I probably said this before as well, that everyone says, how come all the scientists on Quirks and Quarks are so damn articulate? And my answer is because those are the only ones we put on. It's a key point. We have a triage system at Quirks. Every week from those embargoed press packages, we'll choose 20 stories from all the different journals that we want to chase, and we'll phone the lead authors on all those studies and do a pre-interview on the phone to see whether the study is as good as we hoped, but more importantly, to see whether the scientists can communicate. And we kill at least half of them right off the bat. At least half of those stories, even though we'd like to put them on Quirks, if the scientist, cannot speak in layman's terms, cannot explain their work in a way that I can understand, use too much jargon. Unfortunately, on the radio, if they have too strong an accent or stutter, it's not going to work either. But in general, if they can't communicate, they're not going to get on the show. So it's not the fact that all scientists are so fabulous. We only put the ones who are on the program. So that's the first point. The second is looking at the university level. I know a lot of university science programs, particularly at MIT, which I'm a little bit familiar with, have started compulsory science writing courses for their graduate and for their graduate science students. And I think the better science graduate programs across, I think in the States are way ahead of us in Canada on this, but their understanding that communications goes hand in hand with doing the science. You can't lock yourself up in your lab anymore for life and not communicate what you're doing. I think in Canada, even more important, where all of our research institutes and all of our universities are publicly funded, unlike the States.
Yeah.
So, this is something Thomas and I have spoken about, and probably better this message coming from Thomas than from me. But I do think that publicly funded scientists have an obligation to explain what they do to the public. But then going back to the grad students, they have to learn how to communicate. It doesn't come naturally to everyone. And I think it's important for science programs to include science writing and science communications as core compulsory subjects.
Yeah, and we do, as publicly funded researchers, we absolutely have an obligation to speak to the public and explain to the public how we spend their money. And this is, as you said, something we've talked about before. I mean, I have close to $1.5 million in research funding. That's all taxpayer dollar, and I have a responsibility to explain to the people whose money I'm spending how it's being spent, why it's being spent, and what are we doing with that money that makes it a good value. One of the things that all the graduate programs that I've been involved with since I started graduate school in 1991 have started doing a better job of is preparing graduate students for the next step. And so every program, the program I did my master's in, my PhD, my postdoc, the graduate programs here at Laurentian, they have now courses to prepare the graduate students for their next step, whatever the next step is. And I think that's a direct response to the fact that science is becoming more and more competitive. It just seems like every year. And we've realized that if we want our scientists to be competitive, to get grant money, to be successful, they need a better preparation for many things, communication being one of those. However, Colin gets us as far as grade 12, and I'm talking about grad school. And in between, I think, at least from my experience at the schools I've been at, we don't do as good a job with communication in the sciences in between there. And I know that schools are looking at that. I know that people that I teach with here, we're trying to keep a focus on communication and keep people writing, keep people communicating. But there are only so many hours in the day. There are only so many things you can work on. I think we're doing a better job before they leave high school and after they get to grad school, but we're missing a spot in between to get that communication going.
Jim, you've been a wonderful guest, and we can't wait to have you back again because you're a fantastic communicator as well, and I know the people listening are getting a lot of value out of this podcast. But the last question that I have for you is this, which is Quirks and Quirks. Have you ever interviewed any students? Would you consider talking to students who are doing some science in the classroom, that type of thing? Can you build a show around that? Because I'm pretty sure there's a guy over there with what looks like a white collared shirt on with a smartboard behind him that would love to get involved in a project like that.
Well, what I will say is that one thing that we are actually quite proud of on Quirks is that we do actually interview a lot of PhD students on the program who are the lead authors on papers. And, we don't go to their supervisor. We don't go to the head of the lab. If they're the lead author, then we put them on. And occasionally, once or twice a year, a master's student might be lead author on an important paper, and we put on some master's students. As I say, it's more usually PhD candidates. We take a chance on those because quite often what they lack is the overview. So they can tell you exactly what they did on their paper, but then when you say, well, what do your conclusions mean in the wider context of evolutionary biology? And they say, well, I've only ever studied zebrafish, so I don't know. So sometimes we can't put them on because they don't have that wider context. But sometimes they just, knock it out of the park. I mean, the past few weeks we've had a PhD candidate on every week the past few weeks, and they've all been just fabulous communicators, really bright and really delivered.
Jim, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. We really appreciate it, and I know I speak on behalf of Thomas and Colin and all of our listeners out there as well when I say it's been engaging, fun, exciting, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jim.
If Thomas ever thinks of his question, he can email it to me.
Perfect. He'll do that. Be careful what you ask for, Jim. He'll definitely do that. Well, everybody, that brings another show to an end. Thanks very much for tuning in on behalf of Thomas Merritt from Laurentian University, and Colin Jagoe from the Kawartha Pine Ridge District School Board. This is Kevin Cougler, virtual researcher on call, saying thanks for taking the time, and we'll see you again same time next week. Have a good week, everybody.